Hello, Assalamu alaikum students. We are in week 3 now, and today's topic is measuring cost of living, which is our unit 3. And in unit 3, we have 4 units: 3.1, which is what is inflation; 3.2, where we will going to discuss the difference between inflation, disinflation, and deflation, and further types of inflation. And in 3.3, we will going to discuss about how to measure inflation rate through CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, and the last subunit of unit 3, which is 3.4, we will going to discuss problems with the CPI. Today's unit is going to be comprised of 3.1 and 3.2. So let's start our first subunit, which is 3.1. What is inflation? Inflation is a sustained rise in the general price level in an economy over time. When we are saying the general price level rising, it means that the overall prices of the products will going to rise. It does not mean that all the products will going to rise. So the general price level of prices in the economy influences consumers' spending, because an increase in inflation reduces the purchasing power of the individual. Government sets a target inflation rate as a key macroeconomic objectives. So whenever you are studying any of the units, make sure that the 5 objectives will be keeping in your mind. I'm repeating these 5 objectives. Number 1 is the full employment or reduced unemployment, where the government focuses on maintaining the employment level. Number 2 is controlled inflation or price stability, which we are discussing here. And further, definitely we're going to study in other topics where the controlled inflation is going to be done by different public policies such as monetary policy and fiscal policies. Number 3 is the sustainable economic growth. So in next chapter or in next unit, you will going to study the impact of economic growth and its relationship with the productivity and the unemployment topics together. And the fourth objective is the redistribution of income. It means whenever you have an economic growth, the distribution of that growth must be in an overall population, not the one segment. And the fifth objective is balance of payment or the stability. So the last units will going to cover all these objectives. So I'm starting it again. So in inflation, this is our second most important government policies objectives, or the macroeconomic objectives. There are multiple economists who has given different types of definition according to Mayer. An increase in the prices that occurs after full employment has been attained. So it means when you are achieving your targets, full employment level, and if there is an inflation occurs or the rising trend of the prices occurs, that is known as inflation according to Mayer. According to Crowther, In the state of inflation, the prices are rising such that the value of money is falling. So Crowther focuses on the relationship, creating a relationship between pricings and the value of money. So everybody knows that whenever the price rises, you have to pay more of the money to get the same goods and services. So the value of money is falling. This is what the focus of economist Crowther has done. Last definition is related and explained by Colburn. So according to Colburn, in inflation, too much money chase too few goods. It means that the people has more money and they are just trying to buying the goods. So it's a kind of a demand side inflation, which will going to be discussed at the end of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply chapter, demand pull inflation. Inflation and the value of money, which the Crowther has explained. Inflation leads to a decline in the value of money. So inflation means that your money won't buy as much today as you could yesterday. Therefore, inflation tends to cause reduced spendings, less savings, and more borrowings to maintain the same level of standards. If the prices of goods rises, the same amount of money will purchase a smaller quantity. Now we will going to discuss the difference between deflation and disinflation. So previously we were discussing about inflation. Now there are two terminologies sometimes students confused with because both words are very similar. Deflation means the negative rate of inflation. If the inflation rate becomes negative, economists refer it as a deflation. So the overall average prices is falling below 0%. So it becomes a negative rate of inflation. While in disinflation, there is a slowdown in a rate of inflation. It occurs when there is a fall in the rate of inflation. Prices are still rising, but at a slower pace. Like, for example, 7% to 5%. So 7% price rise is also a price rise. When 5%, we are saying that is also a rising prices. But if you compare 7% with the 5%, it's a slower rate. So when the rate of inflation is positive, but still it is falling, if you compare it with the previous quarter or previous month, that is known as disinflation. Disinflation can lead to deflation if not controlled. Definitely, if the rate of inflation is falling from 7 to 5% and then 2%, then 1%, there is a chance that it will go below 0%. So it becomes negative and it becomes a deflation, which is a negative consequences or which has a very, very negative consequences on the overall economy and the standard of living in the country. Here we have taken a graph. Usually the graphical presentation is taken from the website of Fred. Here you can see on your screen, if I slightly highlight it, that there is, you can see a black line which is showing annual rate of inflation. What we have to see in this graph, that is an inflation graph, that this black line is falling and becomes negative. When it becomes negative, which is highlighted by a square here, so from 1%, -1% to -2%, and then starting again, but it remains negative, that is known as deflation. So when rate of inflation becomes negative, you called it as a deflation. While when the rate is falling, or the rate of inflation is falling, that is known as disinflation. And when the rate of inflation is rising, that is known as inflation. So now I'm going to highlight. Here you can see that the rate is falling. If you compare with the previous quarter, for example, here, which I'm highlighting, here it is near 4%, now 3%, now you can see that 2%. So continuously the rate is falling. It means the slower down of the inflation rate, or the lower down of the inflation rate, but it is a positive one. Remember this. Whether it is disinflation or inflation, both are positive rates, while inflation deflation is negative. So when the rate of inflation becomes negative, that is deflation. When it is positive, it is either disinflation or inflation. When you're saying inflation, it means it should be a rising trend. So here it's a rising trend, which is positive and increasing. So this is how you can differentiate between deflation, disinflation, and inflation. Now we were going to discuss the types of inflation. The essence of inflation is that the national currency depreciates in relationship to goods, services, and foreign currency, preserving the stability of its purchasing power. So the first type which we are going to study today, that is creeping inflation. Number two is walking inflation. Number three is galloping inflation. Number four is hyperinflation. There are multiple inflations are there, but this is introductory course of macroeconomics or principle of macroeconomics. So we're not going to go and study all types of inflation. These are the major types of inflation. But there are some other types of inflation like demand pull inflation and cost pull inflation. Demand pull inflation and cost push inflation will going to be discussed in week 7 and 8 in the chapter of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And also, when you will have this long run equilibrium at the end of aggregate supply chapter, the teacher will also discuss the stagflation. Now, we will going to go through the creeping inflation first. What is the definition of creeping inflation? When we are saying creeping inflation, remember this: creeping inflation or mild inflation is when prices rise 3% a year or less. According to Federal Reserve, when prices increases 2% or less, it benefits economic growth. So creeping inflation means that it is beneficial for the economy. Remember this: creeping inflation must be there. So the policymaker always try to have 1 or 2% inflation so that the economy will grow mildly or stable. This kind of mild inflation makes consumer expect that the prices will keep going, that boosts demand. Consumers buy now to beat higher future prices. That's how mild inflation drives economic expansion, which definitely creates an economic growth. For that reason, the Federal Reserve or the economic policies makers sets 2% targets as the inflation rate targets to stabilize the economy and to grow economy. Now the next type is walking inflation. This is our second type of inflation. This is strong or destructive inflation is in between 3 to 10% in a developed countries. Usually, if it is a underdeveloping countries or underdeveloped countries or third world countries, it may be like 6% to 12%, and sometimes the rate varies slightly. It is harmful for the economy because it heats up the economic growth too fast. An economy's recovery will becomes economic boom, and sometimes that boom is not stable and it is out of control, and it creates extraordinary inflation in an economy. So people start to buy more than they need to avoid tomorrow's much higher prices. This increased buying drives demand even further. So people will start buying more and more, and supplier can't keep it up. It's difficult for them because, more importantly, uh, wages will going to start rising, and the cost of manufacturing the goods or the cost of inputs will also going to rise because of the higher inflation. As a result, common goods and services are priced out of the reach of most of the people, and they are unable to buy at those higher prices, which is going to be higher and higher and higher. And at that time, usually uh, the unemployment start rising because there are lots of layoffs because suppliers will unable to supply goods at higher prices because demand wiped out. Next type is galloping inflation. Galloping inflation, when inflation rate rises to 10% or more in a developed countries again. So usually if it is a underdeveloping countries, underdeveloped countries, definitely this rate may be around 12% or 15%, which is alarming. And this galloping is the start of hyperinflation. Remember this. If it is not going to be tackled here by the government intervention, otherwise it may become hyperinflation. So that is a very, very crucial time for any economy because foreign investors avoid that country, depriving it of needed capital. People take out their investments and going in another country because of the higher cost of living, very rapid changes in the inflation rate, the economy becomes unstable and government leaders lose credibility. Galloping inflation must be prevented at all cost. Otherwise, it can become hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is really hyper and it is very, very rapid. It's like a skyrocket and it can easily reach within a month or 2 months or 3 months from 10, 15, 20% to 50% and then 50% to 100 and 150, then maybe 500 and 1000%. So very frequent changes is going to be happened. If the rate of inflation goes so fast, that is known as hyperinflation. It is very rare, but in fact, most example of hyperinflation occurs when government prints too much money to pay for wars. Zimbabwe is the best example. Germany also, after the World War in 1914 to 1918. In 1921, Germany suffers a hyperinflation. That's a post-World War era. Zimbabwe in the 2000 and Venezuela in 2010. So there are multiple examples of hyperinflation when the rate of inflation shoots up, skyrocketed very high. The last time America experienced hyperinflation was during its Civil War. Here, our unit is going to be finished. So we have covered first the inflation, their definition by different economists, and then the difference between the terminology inflation, disinflation, and deflation. After covering that, we have also discussed different types of inflation. So the next unit is our unit 3.3, where we will going to calculate how we will going to find out how to measure consumer price index known as CPI. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture and watch my next video on unit 3.3. Thank you.